This is American Government on Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020. It's a little bit later. I usually submit these the previous night, but it's early morning. And the main reason is I got some whiteout in my eye yesterday, and my eyes were a little sensitive for most of the day. How would a 68-year-old person get whiteout in his eyes? I'm not even sure how many of my students would even know what whiteout is. It's used to be that white stuff you would put on your typing when you made a mistake. And the reason I put it on my eyes on my bookshelf right next to my eye drops, and the bottle is about the same size. And I went to grab it, and when I realized it wasn't eye drops, well, the rest is history, as they say. I'm having a little trouble seeing my notes, so I'm going to be looking a little bit more directly at them if that's all right. Today, we are going to essentially discuss how the Constitution was constructed by the Federal Convention. Now, for me, this is a remarkably fascinating process and even dramatic. And I've tried to lay this out for you in three ways. One, with the schema of dates right on the front page, and then on the bottom of the front page and the second page, an expanded narration of the drama of the convention. And the convention was drama. I don't know if it was as good as the Big Bang Theory, but and then we'll spend the rest of the discussion summarizing the major features of the Constitution. And then on Friday, we'll turn to what I call the theory of the Constitution. So, which is the primary understanding of human beings that the framers fairly self-consciously reflected upon, and when they were designing their institutions, aware of the fact that that they were doing something old and new at the same time. Many countries have been created in the past. Every country has a constitution. But they were self-consciously contributing some of the new aspects of political science that the modern political philosophers had developed, plus a good deal of their own creativity. I'll talk about who these people were in a minute. So in Federalist 10 and 51 are the two primary statements of the overall theory that holds the constitutional system together. And we'll return to that on Friday. So let's begin with where I left off on Monday. And that was the congressional resolution of February 21st, 1787, that called the Federal Convention or Constitutional Convention. Then it was called the Federal Convention. Some historians still refer to it as that. But in our common parlance today, it's the Constitutional Convention. Remember, that resolution was the result of the failure of the Annapolis Convention the previous September. But the one thing that came out of that, as I mentioned on Monday, was the resolution to create another convention, this time for the larger purpose. Now, what was the purpose of the convention? Because as you'll see, very quickly on, a very bitter contention, a division of opinion occurred among the members of the convention. And it was on just this very issue. What exactly was the purpose of the convention? And I read the entire resolution. I'm going to read it again, and I'm going to take the two phrases from the convention that became critical to both sides of the debate. Here's how the resolution reads. Resolved that in the opinion of Congress it is expedient, useful, that on the second Monday in May next, which would have been, I think, May 14th. That's important because, of course, all things in America get started late, and the convention got started late too. But it actually, as you'll see, started on May 25th. It was supposed to start 2 weeks earlier. A convention of delegates who shall have been appointed by the several states be held at Philadelphia for this, and I put this in capital letters to draw your attention, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. Exigency is simply an older and fancy word for necessities. So those two things don't sound very different, but it turns out they can have profoundly different implications for this reason. The first statement, for the sole and express purpose of revising revising the Articles of Confederation. Here's what that clearly meant, and at least for a fair portion of the delegates, it clearly meant this. It meant that the purpose of this convention was not to create a new form of government. The purpose of the convention was to stay within the framework of the Articles, but make a few changes that would make the government stronger, more functional, etc. Now, I would have to say that was probably the majority understanding of the delegates to the convention. But the second phrase, render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. If you think about it, that's a much broader formulation. Here's what that would mean in common sense English. The purpose of the convention is to create a form of government that works for the Union and will keep the Union together and preserve provide good government and preserve the Union. And as you're going to see, that phrase was the one that Madison, for reasons you'll see, and the advocates of the Virginia Plan used when justifying their radical departure from the Articles of Confederation. Because when you read the Virginia Plan, which is the first plan discussed in the convention, it's clear. This is not a revision of the Articles of Confederation. It's a complete abandonment of it and a new frame of government. So you can see the natural question that generates. Was this legitimate if it went beyond the purpose of the convention? And of course, my point here is that depends on how you understand the purpose of the convention. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about the people that came to the convention and who led it. Here are the numbers you should remember: 55, 39, 10. There were 55 total members of the convention appointed by the states who actually attended in one way or another at some point over the 4 months of the convention. But there were 39 who actually stayed and participated fairly consistently over the 4 months. You have to remember, travel was not easy. Inns were not what they are now, and people hated being away from their home and family. And remember, it took George Washington, when he was elected president, 3 weeks to get from Mount Vernon to New York City. And 4 months is a long time. So 55 people attended in some way or another or were appointed. 39 were the working body of that. And 10 were the leading lights, the ones who occupy most of the conversation and directed most of the discussion. Now, how do we know what happened at the convention? There was, in fact, an official secretary, but he only took down like the major votes and the major discussions. It's a very skeletal account. There were a couple of other private accounts of the convention. Lansing in New York, Yates of South Carolina, but James Madison. I could go on right here about why James Madison really is the father of the Constitution, as we typically put it. But in so many ways, you'll come to appreciate his remarkable genius. Probably, again, the only person more intelligent than he, or as intelligent as he, and learned as he, was Alexander Hamilton. And by the way, the framers were a remarkably educated lot. They were not all intellectuals, but these two, Hamilton and Madison, were intellectuals. Madison had taught himself a form of shorthand. And so this diminutive 5'4" Virginia native would get up. The convention generally met from 10 in the morning until about 4 in the afternoon. And even though Madison participated in much of the discussion and etc., he actually took copious shorthand notes. And then when all the other delegates went back to their hotel rooms and drank and ate and gambled and all that, he would spend most of the night then transcribing those notes. He wrote to his wife, Dolly Madison, that the convention almost killed him. So he left those notes in this account, and they're so complete. Now, how do we know that he didn't fib here and there? We don't. But Madison was a pretty conscientious person, and the notes are remarkably extensive. They are almost like transcriptions. And he required in his will that they be published only 50 years after the Constitution uh, was ratified, if it should be so. He didn't want, and this we think quite differently about this today. Judges do, etc., and constitutional interpreters. He didn't want the discussions of the convention to influence the plain and simple meaning of the word. The words are, as you'll see, not quite so plain and simple, and nothing in life is. So 50 years after the convention finished, Madison's notes became public and were printed, and they have become a standard apparatus for understanding the convention. So most of these individuals, by the way, were businessmen, plantation owners, farmers, and some intellectuals. Charles Beard, the historian referred to in the second chapter at the end of Wilson's book in the late 1800s, had written now not debunked so much, but pretty well understood to be crude, a sort of a Marxist almost, an economic analysis of the Constitution, and argued that what moved the members of the Constitutional Convention was a fairly self-conscious class interest. That's probably not true. They were from all of the Union. They had different kinds of property, and they did not, I think, see themselves as oligarchs legislating for their own good. Now, this is, of course, an issue of contention, and what I just mentioned was a very, very schematic opinion. But I think you can say that these individuals were conscientiously trying to save their country from ruin. And they thought the only thing that would save their country from ruin was, in fact, political reform. So, with that in mind, let's take our quick dance through the convention. It would probably be better or easier for you to follow along with the extended narrative. I'm going to have to look at my notes because my vision's still a little blurry. So, let's go back to the beginning of the convention. It was supposed to open on May 14th, but not enough people got there until May 25th to begin proceedings. But one state delegation did get there. And this was critical in terms of shaping the discussion of the Constitutional Convention and its ultimate outcome. And that was the Virginia Delegation. There were 7 members of the Virginia Delegation. Madison was one. George Washington was one. He went very reluctantly, but Madison persuaded him. And that decision, as you'll see, probably was one of the most consequential of the founding period. It doesn't seem like this to us, but you'll see why. George Mason, George Wythe, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia. And why is this important? Because they were there all together 2 weeks before everyone else, and Madison had prepared the draft of an alternative constitution called the Virginia Plan. So this proves it's always better to be prepared when you go into a meeting. So because of this, and moreover, as you'll see, Madison persuaded Washington not only to attend the convention, but also to put himself up for president of the convention, at which the convention on the first day chose him as president. Why is that important? Because the Constitution did pass in the states when we go through the ratification process. It did pass. It passed 9 of the states and eventually all the states. It was the most open and democratic discussed form of government in the history of the world for reasons that I've mentioned several times: the literacy of the American people, the wide availability of the drafted Constitution in newspapers and church bulletins, etc. But it was still, you have to remember, it was a novelty. It was a new form of government. And most Americans at that time were afraid of letting go of the power of the states. And the Constitution clearly proposes a strong national government, as you'll see. So you could say it was a chancy thing. And in some of the states, like in New York, which I mentioned on Monday, it almost didn't pass. It only passed by 3 votes. So Washington, there were 2 most beloved human beings, Americans at that time, and world famous human beings who were both loved by Americans and respected and by the entirety of the whole world. Benjamin Franklin was one of them, and George Washington was the other. Probably without Washington's presence at the convention and without his agreeing to be its president, which then added much weight and credibility to the whole affair. It may be that the Constitution would not have had enough public support to pass, but it did because of that matter. So on the first day of the convention, they met, they decided on some rules of order, they elected Washington as president. What kind of rules of order did they pick for discussion? They decided, for instance, that for when anyone addressed the body, that he had to stand up. That no one could walk between a person addressing the body and the president so as to distract them. And they also decided on that first day to keep the deliberations secret. Why did they do that? I think because they wanted to make sure they were free to concentrate on the best form of government without any public pressure or public concern. Could we achieve that today? It's hard for us to walk into our bathrooms and keep that meeting secret today. I really don't think it could have been done. Why is that important? Because these people did not exactly dress in bikinis. And it was a hot summer in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a hot city like Washington and Columbia, South Carolina. They're swamps. And the same with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was hot. So they decided to keep the windows closed as a result. And they did, in fact, manage to keep the whole proceedings secret. So it opens on May 25th. On May 29th, which you have to realize is almost instantly after the thing got going, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, stands up and offers the Virginia Plan. Now, I'm going to presume that you've looked at the plans of the convention in the Nichols Reader. It's clear this is not a revised Articles of Confederation. It has, first of all, it's a bicameral, two-house legislature, with both being based on proportional representation of the states by population. What that means, in other words, is the confederal or federal structure of the Union has been essentially abandoned. And in its place, the Virginia Plan contemplates a national government drawn from the American people and representing the American people. This was the most amazing thing, and everybody noticed it first. There were three branches of government. Now, note, you'll see all plans at the convention now proposed a three-branch form of government with separation of powers. They realized that had been a mistake. So even the supporters of the New Jersey Plan, which is the closest thing to the revised articles, embodies separation of powers, especially admitting the necessity of an executive branch. Although, let's be clear, at this point in the convention, both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan had relatively weak executives. The Edmund Randolph, who proposed it, although Madison wrote it, he didn't specify the number of executives. But the New Jersey Plan clearly called for a committee of executives, and ultimately Randolph, who proposed the Virginia Plan, wanted also it to be a committee. He wanted a three-person executive with a president from the North, a president from the Middle States, and a president from the Southern states. So you'd have to say, even though the Virginia Plan proposes a national government, it lacks one of the final features of the Constitution, because that feature arose in discussion and later, and that is the strong presidency, which is what I consider one of the three great novelties, new things in the Constitution, as we'll see. So they started discussing the Virginia Plan immediately. Some rather remarkable proposals were added right at the beginning. James Wilson from Pennsylvania stood up on June 2nd and proposed a single-person presidency. And just a few days later, that president being nationally and directly elected by the people, which did not survive in the final Constitution. As you know, it's the Electoral College that elects the president. Of course, we'll speak a lot about that later. So for about 2 weeks, then, the convention was dominated by the Virginia Plan. and its 21 resolutions were sort of worked through. But it's clear that during that time, uh, uh, quiet resistance and resentment was beginning to build in at least a substantial portion of the delegates, for two reasons. One of them I've mentioned. Uh, the resolution calling the convention into being said revise and enlarge the articles. So at least a good portion of the convention members thought that the Virginia plan was illegitimate, that it was outside of the bounds of the purpose of the convention, and should be abandoned. The second reason was most of the delegates were still committed to the confederal plan of government. Remember, in the Articles of Confederation, there were larger and smaller states, but each state only had one vote. They could send from 2 to 5 representatives, but each state only had one vote. So all the states were equal because the states were the actual members of the Union. The name of the country was the United States of America. So most of the delegates at that point, in fact, some of the delegates had been instructed by their legislatures not to support any plan in the convention that departed from the federal basis of the Union. So on June 15th, led by William Paterson of New Jersey, and that's why this plan is called the New Jersey Plan or the Paterson Plan, William Paterson stood up and offered an alternative plan, the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan kept the federal structure of the Union, kept it did add kept the unicameral structure of Congress, just a one-house Congress, with the same basis of representation. It did add 3 departments of government, but a weak, dependent executive elected by the Congress, as even the Virginia Plan called for that. Because remember, 11 of the state governments had their governors elected by the legislature. So naturally, most people came to the convention with their existing reality in mind. So now note though, both of these plans did address one failing of the articles, and that was no enforcement mechanism over the states. Let me deal with this now because I won't speak about it later. And that was they realized that even though the articles said pretty please to the states, obey the articles, obey the Congress, they never did. So even the New Jersey Plan added, and what did the New Jersey Plan add? That the president or the executive branch could call out the military force of the Union against a recalcitrant or disobedient state. The reason they rejected that eventually is they realized that every matter of of national enforcement would become a civil war. And we did eventually have a civil war in which the national military power of the government, national government, was called out to keep the recalcitrant Confederate states in place. Now, the Virginia Plan, this is when Madison thought this through. He would give to Congress the power to revise, examine, and veto every state law passed by a state. Now, that was eventually abandoned because they realized that once the Union got going, that would mean they'd have no time for national legislation. They would be constantly reviewing the legislation of the states. So that plan, that part of the Virginia Plan and the plan in the New Jersey Plan was abandoned. As you'll see, there is a surviving form of national compliance. I'll give you a hint, and where we'll see at the end of the lecture, and that's judicial review. So, on June 18th, 3 days after the New Jersey Plan, Alexander Hamilton, who had not said much in the convention up till that point, stood up and offered, appropriately, the Hamilton Plan. Now, the Hamilton Plan was a complete departure from the Articles. It had a 2-house legislature, both based on proportion, with a president, a single president, elected for life, and a Senate for life, by the way. And the president would have the power to appoint the governors of the states. It's clear, by the way, that Hamilton was in favor of a very strong government, what was called energetic government at that point. And it's also clear that that plan would have never had a chance of passing the convention. Why did he offer it? First of all, remember, he was a remarkable individual, and that day, the convention notes say that at 10 o'clock the House opened. Alexander Hamilton stood to be recognized and then spoke for 6 hours. even his enemies thought that this was one of the most remarkable public speaking events they'd ever seen. To stand and speak for 6 hours, I mean, I could do it, but I would never make sense, and I'd have to have a coffee break from time to time. So Hamilton clearly thought the states would eventually destroy the Union. He clearly thought that an elected democratic body couldn't govern or lead the country. So he clearly thought, so his plan probably does represent some aspects of his view of government, but it looks clearly more like the old British Constitution where the king appointed the governors, etc. So why did he offer it? Most historians think he did not offer it in order to be kept considered seriously, but rather as an alternative to the New Jersey an alternative to the New Jersey plan, which would make the New Jersey plan look more extreme and make the Virginia plan look more moderate. That is to say, he is understood to have offered a an extreme plan on one side, so that the plan that probably might have passed the convention would also look extreme, and therefore he triangulated, so to speak, the Virginia plan. If that was his intention, and most historians believe that it was, then it worked, because on the next day, June 19th, the House went into what's called in parliamentary rules, committee of the whole, and voted to stay with the Virginia plan. This should actually be celebrated as one of the most important days of our history, because if we had stayed with the New Jersey plan, eventually much of our history would not have happened, for better or worse. There would not have been a civil war. Why? Because the issue of slavery and the human status of the slaves as American citizens would never have come up if we had retained the Confederation. We probably would not have entered the world wars. It's not clear we would still have survived as a single country. So this day, June 19th, when the convention decided to stay with the Virginia plan, and the Virginia plan does become the essential structure of the Constitution with important modifications, was a momentous day in American history. So for the rest of June and then into July, they pretty much go through and start discussing the provisions. But the small states, the Confederalists, the ones who don't think the Confederation should be abandoned, dig in their heels for the second great crisis of the convention. And that was the basis of representation in the Senate. It's clear that they had lost on the larger structure of government, but they refused to give in on some essential feature of a confederal structure of government with the states possessing an equality. And the mood of the convention got very, very bitter. Even Madison, right before the 4th of July weekend, which was already being celebrated as a holiday, said he was so sick of everything he would come home. The guy that organized the convention. So on July 16th, this is called the Great Compromise, sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise, sometimes called the Sherman Compromise from Roger Sherman of Connecticut. That was offered and accepted, and that saved the convention, where the House of Representatives would be directly elected by the people and based on the proportional representation of the population in the states. So who and what is represented in the House? The American people, for the first time. Who's represented in the Senate? In the Senate, the states are equal, and even the small states have 2 senators. So in some ways, you could say our government, our Constitution, is partly confederal, partly national. But that was the great compromise that saved the convention, and then it went on for the rest of July, pretty much to work out the other parts of the Virginia plan. On July 26th, they decided to take a recess. They appointed a 11-person committee on detail to draft the proposals that had been voted and discussed into a coherent proposal. And on August 6th, 1787, the convention re-adjourned. Here's just an anecdote. They didn't have Xerox machines, of course, and they couldn't text it. So they had what was called an amanuensis, somebody who would make a fair hand copy of what you were trying to copy. And they had 55 of them made up and passed out to the members of the convention. Now, George Washington was the president, but he was one of the tallest Americans at the time, 6'1" or 2" or something like that. 4, I think, actually, come to think of it, and was widely respected, if not revered. He was a very stern man, self-cultivated stern man. As the delegates were coming back into the hall, Independence Hall, on August 6th, one of them evidently had put it in his back pocket, and it slipped out and fell on the ground. Washington happened to come right around at that time and didn't see who dropped it, but found it. When the convention opened up, he sternly said, you took a solemn promise to keep these deliberations confidential. Which one of you was so irresponsible as to drunk? And of course, nobody ever admitted it. So that's the kind of prestige he inserted. By the way, August 6th also is another important day in U.S. history. It's the day that we dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So the convention resumes with now the 22 drafted resolutions of the Virginia plan in the coherent plan, the work of the Committee on Detail. About August 8th, the third crisis that almost tears the convention apart happens, and that is slavery. The southern states at that point demanded some kind of recognition of the special place of slavery in American life, and they got it, by the way. And it was a bitter debate, and nevertheless, in order to get the Union going and get the Constitution drafted, the framers did agree to protect slavery in 3 parts of the Constitution: the 3/5 clause in Article 1, Section 2, the importation and migration clause in Article 1, Section 9, and Article 4, Section 2, the fugitive slave clause. We will discuss these much fully next week when we go through the Constitution. So with that crisis passed, the convention sailed along until the end of August, and they encountered their last big division of opinion. Not a crisis, but a division of opinion, and that was how to elect the president. So you only had 3 alternatives: imitate the states and have the president be elected by the legislature, by the Congress. You could have the people elected by the people. 2 of the states, Massachusetts and New York, did have a popularly elected separate governor. Or you would have some third alternative of an intermediate body that would elect the president. Why didn't they choose national direct popular vote? Because they simply didn't think the country was logistically capable of it. Also, there was some reservation about the masses of the people being capable of appointing the first magistrate, as he was called. But it was more an issue of practicality. Why not stay with legislative election? Because as the convention had unfolded, the delegates actually learned through discussion and debate. They came to realize that separation of powers, as Madison will explain in Federalist 51, separation of powers isn't just 3 branches of government. They have to be somewhat independent of each other, or else one branch will control the other 2. So they clearly abandoned legislative election of the president because they knew that the president would be a puppet of the Congress. So on August 31st, they adopted the Electoral College. More about that later. And on September 5th to September 12th, my birthday, the Committee on Style was appointed, including Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris of New York, who were strong executive people. And in that meeting, the final draft of the Constitution was prepared. On September 12th, it was reported back to the convention. They debated a few extra provisions. And then on September 16th, the last working day in the convention, George Washington stepped down from the presidency chair. He hadn't actually participated in debate in order to offer a proposal. And that was to reduce the number of individuals for the minimal basis of representation in the House from 1 over 40,000 to 1 over 30,000. And that suggestion was adopted unanimously. He resumed the chair, and then on September 17th, the Constitution was signed and adopted, but 3 individuals who had been participants through the whole convention, Randolph, who had actually submitted the Virginia plan, and George Mason of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts refused to sign the Constitution. They thought the president was too powerful. They thought the national government was too powerful. And the Constitution had no Bill of Rights. Now, that became a major issue in the ratification, as we'll see. So, all the other delegates did sign it too, and I'm going to get a little teary here because it was one of my favorite quotes. Benjamin Franklin, who attended the convention all throughout, but who was close to death and died within the year, and feeble, had gout, and could barely speak, had all of his speeches written out and handed them to Alexander Hamilton, who read them for him. But on the last day, as the delegates were signing the Constitution, he was heard to say this out loud. The president, having asked what the convention meant should be done with the journals and whether copies were to be allowed to the members if applied for, it was resolved, nobody disagreeing, that the president retained the journal and other papers subject to the order of the Congress, if ever formed under the Constitution. The members then proceeded to sign the document. Whilst the last members were signing it, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair at the back, of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. I have, said he, often in the course of this session, and in the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun, which turned out to be prophetic. The Constitution being signed by all the members except Mr. Randolph, Mr. Mason, and Mr. Gerry, who declined giving their sanctions, the convention dissolved itself by an adjournment sine die, as they say in American English, without another day of convening. And that was the Constitutional Convention. So how to summarize their product? We will spend much time in the next couple of sessions after this week examining the structure of the Constitution and its contents. So, in order to help my students understand the complexity of the Constitution in a simple way, and even though I'm not an empirical political scientist, I have had several courses in statistics, but I can barely count the change in my pocket, I constructed this helpful equation, somewhat in jest, but seriously. Here's the Constitution expressed in a convenient, summary, almost algebraic equation. C equals VA, parenthesis, subsection 2, S, I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing, plus H in subsets, Roman numeral 2, all over JR. What does this obscure thing mean? The Constitution is essentially the Virginia Plan, with the addition of the equal representation of the states in the Senate, an important modification. Plus, it turned out Hamilton's long 6-hour speech was not useless. And because he was a member of the final Committee on Style, many of the aspects of the final wording, especially that touch on presidential power, went in. The president is the strongest executive in the world. And up to that point, as we'll see, only strong executives were dictators. So you have to say Hamilton did have an influence on the final Constitution in the character of the presidency. And the Roman numeral 2 refers to Article 2 of the Constitution, all over judicial review. That's what the JR stands for. Judicial review is the power of the courts to review the legislation of the states, the actions of the president and the Congress for their constitutionality. No state had that clearly. That was a novelty, almost invented suggested by a couple of members of the convention, and indeed survives in Article 6. Remember, the idea of Congress revising the laws of the states was thrown out. The idea of military enforcing of the laws of the states was thrown out. So the courts so the Constitution turns to the courts to steadily enforce and maintain the supremacy of the national government and the Constitution in Article 6, as we'll see. So that will help you remember the essence of the Constitution. I believe the Constitution has three political novelties that had never been present before in human history in any form of government. We will examine these more thoroughly as the course unfolds. First, the new federalism. A federation and a confederation, those terms were often used the same back then. A confederation is a union of sovereign states, equal states. And you have to see that up till this point in time, humanity was faced politically with an either or. Either you had a national government with a strong national center that governed from a national center, and most states in history, most countries in history had strong national governments. Or you had a confederation, like the Athenian Confederation, like the Swiss Confederation, or etc., or like the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution, for the first time, takes elements of both of these and blends them together. We do have a national government under the Constitution, as you'll see. We, the people, are its opening words. But it is sufficiently moderated in procedural and structural features with an attention to the states as states. So that had never been done before, and it's messy. And that explains why the question of the boundary of power between the states and the national government has been one of the oldest and most contentious issues under our Constitution. And we'll see that in a couple of weeks. Second, the extended or large republic. All of the American people vote for representation in Congress and even for the president through the Electoral College. Again, here you had essentially two alternatives in human history before. You either had a democracy or a republic. Will blur the distinction for the time being. In which case you had a small government. All republics, all democracies were small. The Athenian assembly met in person with about 25,000 people, a quarter of the population at a time. So in some ways, you could have large countries. Most countries in the world had been large empires, at least important, powerful countries. But of course, those weren't republics. Those were dominated by strong executives, either a king or a dictator or a general or an emperor. So, and look what happened to Rome when it grew too large to be a republic. It finally transformed into an empire. So, in some ways, for the first time, the American drafters of the Constitution took the possibility that you could have millions of people over an extensive and huge territory voting for a Republican form of government, a popular form of government. We'll see that theory defended and presented in Federalist 10. But never had there been a huge or large extended republic. And last, the presidency, the strong, popular constitutional executive. Again, history had presented either ors. Either you had a republic where the people ruled and had broad civil freedom and essentially popular opinion was the basis of governmental policy in some ways, or you had dictators or kings or monarchs or emperors. So, for the first time, the Constitution takes and creates a very vigorous, very strong executive. Today, then and today in some ways, certainly today, when, for like it or not, the president has the power to kill the human race 50 times over through the black briefcase of nuclear codes that he carries around. The president is the most powerful executive in the world, not unconstrained. The constitutional framework constrains the presidency, and popular elections compel the president to appeal to the people. So, with this in mind, we'll examine each of these three new things that had never been seen before as essential parts of the constitutional system. Again, on Friday, we'll turn to Federalist 10 and 51 and explore theoretically some of the features I just mentioned. The last page of the notes, by the way, I put, again, the schema of the convention as a timeline so you could see it a little bit differently. That's how the Constitution came to be. That's what the convention did. And as we'll see, that is the framework of government which almost all governments, in one way or another, but not in every feature, has imitated since the time of the founding.